Okay, so I want us to continue this morning with something that we had started yesterday, which is a discussion about purchasing goods from a known thief. When you know that someone is dealing in stolen goods, the halacha is that you're not allowed to purchase those goods from them. Now, we saw two reasons that were given. Reason number one is that when an object is stolen, it still is in the possession of the original owner. So when I purchase it, I'm not actually purchasing it legally, because it's legally not in the possession of the seller, and therefore my transaction is an invalid transaction, and therefore I'm an accessory to theft because I have in my possession an item that belongs to somebody else. Okay, I want to make sure that that's clear. But then the Rav Shulchan Aruch told us that there's a second reason, which is that you're misayeya yidei ovrei avera. You're aiding and abetting a sinner by helping a person unload stolen goods. Because if there was no one who was going to buy from him, he wouldn't steal, presumably, if he couldn't find anyone to sell these goods to what is it called, fencing, right? To pawn off these goods on. So you're actually violating the law of lifnei iver lo sitein mechshol. So this led Rav Stern to discuss in this paragraph that we started looking at yesterday, well, what if the first reason no longer applies? Meaning, what if halachically the stolen item is no longer in the possession of the original owner? And when does that happen? That occurs halachically if after the theft takes place, the ganav does one of two things. Either he does shinui rishus, he gives it to a third party or sells it to a third party, or he does a permanent change in the object that he stole. So if he steals wooden planks and then he turns those wooden planks into a piece of furniture or into a permanent structure, and he has to saw down and cut up the planks such that they can never be restored to their original state, so then the object no longer belongs to the original owner, but rather there's a financial debt between the ganav to the original owner that he has to pay him the value of what he originally stole. And it would seem, therefore, that the first reason no longer applies. If I know that someone has a stolen good that he's permanently changed in its physical structure, such that the object no longer belongs to the original owner, my purchase of that item is a legitimate purchase and it will belong to me. So based on the first reason that was given, it would be permitted for me to purchase the item. But what about the second consideration, which is your misayeya yidei ovrei avera? You're helping a thief. You're helping a thief commit theft, and you're encouraging him to do it more. So this was the dilemma that Rav Stern had presented, because it sounded like from the verbiage of the Rav Shulchan Aruch that it's only going to be, and based on the way that the halach is expressed in other places, that it's only usher when the object retains its original status of being in the possession of the owner, and it's no longer, you're right, and that's the reason why I can't purchase it, because it's an invalid purchase. But if we could justify the purchase as being a legitimate purchase, it would be okay. But what about the consideration of being misayeh yidei ovrei avera, that I'm aiding and abetting a ganav and encouraging to do more? So this is the dilemma that he discusses, and he started off by quoting the Rambam. If you see where my cursor is, he says, it would seem that even when the item has physically changed, it should not be permitted to purchase it. He says, because one of the reasons, at least, that you're not allowed to buy from a ganav is Kamosha Kosav HaRambam, Perakei Hilchos Geneva Halacha Aleph, is based on what the Rambam writes in the laws of theft. Shehu machzik bazeh yedei ovrei avera, that you're aiding and abetting sinners. The gorim lo lignov genevos acheros, and you're encouraging him to steal in the future. Uchamoshe hetik kan haravis devar, as the Rav Shulchan Aruch cites from the Rambam. Vimkein lefi zeh mistaver haya lomar da'af shenishtane hachefetz ukanal yedei zeh haganav lio shelo. He says that it would be usher even if the object has physically changed and therefore is no longer in the halachic possession of the original owner. And therefore all that's now owed to the original owner is a cash debt and not the original item. Then, but you still have the consideration that you're encouraging him if we allow you to buy from him. And he says, and indeed, I have found in the Yam Shel Shlomo from the Maharshal of the 16th century that he actually agrees with this. Sorry. But then Reb Stern quotes from other sources that do permit you to purchase a stolen item that has physically been altered from a ganav. And he says, I don't understand what their rationale is. So, and as a matter of fact, we're going to see a later seif in this chapter, which talks about if a person steals livestock, such that when he stole the livestock, the animals were calves, and then they grow older, and they become full-grown. He steals foals, and they become full-grown cows or bulls. Then even though you know it's stolen, you are permitted to buy the livestock from the ganav. And so it seems to be a bit of a contradiction. And so here's the dilemma. So without going into too much of the background information, I just wanted to bring you to the punchline. He says, Ulam adayin sarachian, it's the last 5 lines of this paragraph. He says, but we still have to figure out my time of be'emes pasak harav lekaman deshari liknos hecha shenishtana. Why does the Rav Shulchan Aruch himself paskin later on? We'll wait till we get to later on in this chapter, that when the item has been altered physically, then you are permitted to purchase from the ganav. He says, Umadua ein bazech shasha davar zeh yigram lo lignov od. Why isn't there a concern that this is only going to encourage the ganav to steal in the future? V'yesh lomar. And he says, the answer that I would suggest is, Dekeven de be'etzem kol ma'ase geneva karuch b'sikun. He says, the fact of the matter is that every act of theft it involves some level of risk. Shahaganav misakei nafsho umachnis atzmo l'sakana. That any time a person takes upon himself to act as a burglar, as a thief, he's actually endangering himself. He endangers his life. He puts himself at risk of being incarcerated. Shema yitfesuhu v'yanishuhu kashos, because he may be arrested, he may be thrown in jail, he may be punished, or even worse. V'lachein bishlama imhu yachol limkor miyades hachefetz haganov b'li hamtana v'tircha. He says, and it's one thing, therefore, if a guy can steal and then offload the item that he stole quickly and easily without any hassles, then if we allow people to purchase things immediately after he stole them, for him to do a quick turnaround, that's something that the Rambam says you're not allowed to do, because that's going to encourage him to steal in the future. Aval heicha shetzarech lishanot et hagneva kagon tle v'nasa ayil o egel v'nasa shor. But let's say the guy is in the thievery business for the long term, meaning that he steals items and keeps them and raises them and cultivates them or alters them over the course of an extended period of time. So, for example, he steals foals and lets them grow into full-grown animals. Oh, Bishar Devar.
Cattle rustler.
What's that?
Sorry. A cattle rustler.
He's a cattle rustler. But he's not just a cattle rustler who, does a quick turnaround, right? What he does is that he steals them as calves and then lets them grow old and keeps them for an extended period of time, where the chances of him being caught are far greater. Oh, bishar dvarm shetzarach ma'aseh kagon be'etzim shetzarach lashufan o lachkok bahem, or with other things that he has to actually spend time manufacturing, keeping in his possession. So, for example, if he's a wood thief and he has to now then go and alter them, avanim shetzarach l'sasas anuchadoma, or if he steals gems and he needs to cut them. So, in all of these cases, kol elu tzarach zman otircha liknosan b'shinui ma'aseh. All of these things require time, and they require exertion and effort in order to change them. V'lachein lo asru liknos mimenu de'ein ze gorim kol kach sheyignov od. He says these are things that the purchaser is not as directly involved in encouraging to steal in the future. Kevin shebenosaf l'maisa hagneva shetzarach l'sakein nafsho tzarach od litrochbo, because in addition to knowing that he can turn them over to a buyer, he has to also take additional risks and go to additional efforts. So apparently, in other words, my level of participation in encouraging him to steal is not as direct when he has to go through a lot of effort in order to alter the product that he stole or to cultivate the product that he stole. He says, and even though ultimately I am still abetting him in future theft, because if he didn't have anyone he could unload it, he wouldn't do this, but it's not as direct. And my share in the encouragement of future theft is not as direct, because apparently this guy has this condition that causes him to steal despite the great risk, and he does it for his own thrill. And therefore, lo asruzos chazal holamin hadin kinam. He says that therefore our rabbis did not out and out forbid purchasing an item that has altered, because at the end of the day, the ganef has actually acquired it. And as we'll learn later on, when we learn the source for it, the Torah only says you have to return the item that you stole. But if the item that you stole is no longer the item that you stole because it's been altered, you no longer have an obligation to return the original item, but you have rather a cash debt to the person from whom it was stolen. So that's Rav Stern's answer to this question. He suggests that perhaps when someone goes to the extent of stealing something and altering it, there are other factors involved in his pathology, I guess you could call it, other than knowing that he can always offload it. But apparently he's in this because he enjoys this business. And therefore my sort of participation in his encouraging of thievery is not as direct, is not as large, is not as significant. Therefore, the rabbis did not forbid it. Now, as I was reading this, I was thinking to myself about an industry that I know about, because I grew up in LA, called chop shops. You ever hear of a chop shop? Does anyone know what a chop shop is?
To do with cars, and they take stuff out of the cars?
It's got to do with cars. There's a whole business in LA and probably in New York as well, in other urban areas, where, and I'm not going to get into the ethnicities involved, but people would steal cars.
Not a Jewish business,
right? It's not a Jewish business, but people from different ethnicities would steal cars, and this goes on all the time. And then they drive them into these auto garages, which are called chop shops, which have a front as being an auto garage for mechanics, but they also deal in stolen vehicles. And what they do is that they cut up the car to make it no longer recognizable as the original car. They strip it, they paint it, they do all of these things to alter it, and then they're able to export the car to either to Mexico or in some way get it out of the state or get it across the border. And that's how they make their money. And that's why oftentimes when you have a car stolen, they can't retrieve it, or at least this is the way it used to be. Maybe now the technology is more sophisticated. And so to me, I think this may have been the argument at one point in history, but there are certain kinds of areas of theft, of industries of theft, where I don't think that this argument would apply. If there's such a developed network of chop shops, such that they have perfected the technique of stealing a car and then quickly within 24 hours completely reconditioning the car so that it's no longer recognizable as the car that was stolen, so that they can get it out of the country and ship it to Mexico, then it seems to me that even though that's a case of a Geneva that has been physically altered, by allowing a person halachically to purchase those cars, you are directly aiding and abetting, because it's built into that whole industry of theft is the method of how to get it out of the country by altering it. So I think that there's validity to this argument that Rav Stern raises in order to explain why it's okay to purchase livestock that has been altered over the course of time. But I think one has to really carefully consider the industry of theft that is in question. If built into that particular type of thievery is a very well perfected methodology of how to alter the object so that it's no longer recognizable, so that you can hide it from the police. They file down the serial number and then they repaint it. So then the same argument of Misayeh de Ovre Avera should still apply, even when the object has been altered. So it's just something to keep in mind. Okay.
Rabbi, I had the same sort of discomfort in a way. This seems almost more premeditated than just stealing something and then trying to sell it quickly. Like when you've got this whole business going,
correct.
Even with the cattle and everything else, like I would suggest that somehow you're helping an entire industry as opposed to just someone who happens on an object, steals it, and then tries to resell it.
I would have to assume that maybe in the ancient world it was not such a common thing for people to steal livestock and then hold on to it for an extended period of time. Probably because it was considered to be such a risk of being caught that it wasn't done regularly. But I don't know, I don't know. But I think we're going to have to leave this as sort of a question in our mind, that there is this gray area in halacha, and one always has to resort back to this issue that the Rambam raises, that even if halachically it no longer belongs to the original owner, if, however, you are encouraging ganovim to do this activity in the future because they know that they always have buyers on the market, then you're not allowed to participate. Can anyone think of examples of where this,
well, knockoffs, for example, that's stealing kind of ideas. So, the purses and the CD, the movies and CDs and whatever.
Yeah, right. There was this mall somewhere in Toronto, which is considered
another ethnicity issue. I wasn't going to mention it by name, but it was out in Scarborough.
Right, out in Scarborough, that it was considered to be the largest in North America of dealing specifically in knockoffs and pirated goods.
Yeah.
Pirated DVDs and all of these other, you could pay $1 for a newly released film on a DVD. I had a guy who gave a bunch of them. He thought he was doing me a favor, gave me a bunch of these DVDs. I said, where did you get this? This is pirated stuff. I said, you can't even bring this into my home. I mean, this is stolen goods. And he says, oh, what's the big deal? Everybody does it. It's out in the open. No one does anything about it. So I said, but this is classic Misayeh de Ovre Avera. You're by your purchasing from this openly illegal mall, and then you saw what happened. It was like a year or two ago. There was a raid, and they shut down most of the shops in that place. Yeah. Okay. Now, the next piece is
Rabbi.
Yes.
Use the example of the cow, and if you steal the cow and sell the milk, that would be a change, a shinui.
Yeah, that would be a shinoi, or if you sell the fleece, right, that would be a shinoi as well. If you steal a sheep and you steal its fleece, the fleece no longer presumably belongs to the original owner. It grew in the possession of the ganav. I think the Gemara gives those as examples, if I'm not mistaken, but my memory's still a little fuzzy on those areas. We probably will see them as we go further in this chapter, because we're going to talk about stealing livestock.
Thank you.
Okay, sure. Now, another point that I wanted to raise is that just in general, it's worth educating ourselves on this principle of being machzik yidei ovrei avera, to help other people and encourage them to do future sins, is something that is a halacha, but there's an interesting distinction in the halacha whether this is a rabbinical law or whether this is a biblical law. And what emerges from the poskim is that the only time something is biblically prohibited in the category of lifnei iver lo titein michshal, do not place a stumbling block before a blind man, is only when the only way that person can do the prohibited act is through my participation and helping him. It's what's called trei avrei de nahara. If, let's say, the illustration that is described by Chazal is two sides of the river, meaning that the only way that this guy can do the Aveira is if I give him a ride so that he can pass over from one side of the river to the other where the Aveira is waiting for him. If there's no way for him to cross the river other than my giving him my boat so that he can get across the river, so then I am in violation of lifnei iver by letting him use my boat to go from one side of the river to the other so that he can do the Aveira that he wants to do. But let's say there are many boats, or there are many other access points for him to do the Aveira, so that even if I don't help him, he'll be able to find and recruit someone else's help in order to do the Aveira. So then there is no longer the biblical prohibition of lifnei iver lo titein michshal, but there is nonetheless a rabbinic prohibition of misayeh yidei ovrei avera, aiding and abetting a sinner. Okay, and you will encounter this if you haven't already. This is a very important distinction, and it has certain ramifications, because there's a whole question whether misayeh yidei ovrei avera applies to non-Jews. Since it's a rabbinic law, it may only extend to helping Jews do a sin. So, for example, let's say I'm a merchant of knickknacks and jewelry, and a non-Jew walks into my store and wishes to buy a Buddha statue. Okay, am I allowed to sell a Gentile a Buddha statue? Let's assume that for a moment, let's suspend all other considerations, and let's assume that's idolatry. Okay, I know that a Gentile is prohibited in idolatry just as a Jew is. Am I allowed to sell a Buddha statue to a non-Jew? Well, it depends. If you understand that he can always go down the block and buy a Buddha statue from another merchant, and it's only a rabbinic law when it's not Trei Avri Denahara, when it's not the two sides of the river example. In other words, there's other ways for him to commit idolatry other than coming into my shop. So then it would be permitted for me to sell him the Buddha statue, right? So this is the reason why this sometimes has ramifications in halacha. So let's take a look. He writes, Harambam Perakei Hilchos Gezela Halacha Aleph Kosav Shehu Machzik Yidei Ovre Avera VeOver Alifnei Iver Lo Titein Michshol. The Rambam writes that when I help someone else steal, I am aiding a sinner, and I'm causing him. I'm violating the words of the Torah. Lifnei Iver, do not place a stumbling block before the blind. Behetiko Shulchan Aruch Siman Shin Samach Tes Sif Aleph, and this is cited by the Shulchan Aruch. V'nira kavanato de over midirabanan, and it would seem that this is only a rabbinic law. The harei min haTorah leka isura rak betrei avri denahara kideita perakama da avoda zara, and it seems like that this is only a rabbinic law of lifnei iver and not a biblical law, because you need the two sides of the river. You need it that the only way that he can do the Avera is through my assistance in order for it to be rise to the biblical prohibition. And therefore, in this case, when a guy can always sell stolen goods to other people, he doesn't need me in particular. So I'm not committing a biblical prohibition, but I am committing a rabbinic prohibition. Va'af l'shitat hamishnah l'melech perak daled mehilchos milva din bei shekosab shem harav pnei Moshe dehecha delo v'roa shahamalva mosif mos elu liyisrael acher leka mishum lifnei iver. He says, now there's an interesting discussion in the laws of loans. What prohibition is involved in the laws of loans? When you lend money, there's an isser to lend money on interest. Let's say I go to a Jew and I say, I need to borrow money. And he says, well, I'll lend you the money with 10% interest. And I'm desperate. And I say, okay. So not only am I committing an Avera for myself, but I'm also Misayeya Yidei over Avera. I'm aiding and abetting him to lend money on interest. The Moshe Kos Yain Lenazir Lo Michayev Mishum Lifnei Iver Ela B'Dekoy B'Trei Avri Benahara Aval Bolav Hachilo. He says there's one opinion that states that I'm only in rabbinic violation because he could always lend the money to somebody else. He doesn't need me in order to do the prohibition of lending money on interest. V'hu cholek alav delo dami lenazir, but the Mishnah Lamelech disagrees, and he says no. He says when it comes to monetary issues like loans, the sham im lo hayamoshet zehakos lo hayanasa klal ha'isr lifnei iver. He says the classic example is, I know a guy is a nazir. A nazir is not allowed to drink wine. I go ahead and I take the cup of wine, and the only way that he has access to this wine is by giving him the cup of wine. If I don't give him the cup of wine, he has no wine to drink. So there's a biblical, he says, if there are other cups of wine that the Nazir can drink, there's only a rabbinic violation of Lifnei Iver. But the Mishnah Melech argues that borrowing money from someone who's only willing to lend it on interest is worse than that. He says, "Aval gabi ribis dim lo lo v'zeh hayalo v'ha'acher over al lifnei iver b'shvil zeh lo niftar milifnei iver va'odahacha aser de'efsher halo v'ha'acher yachzer bo v'lo yilveh v'nimtza di'ihu machshel hamalveh ad kan devarav." He says, when it comes to individual dealings with a financial dealing between two parties, it's difficult to make that justification that it's not biblically prohibited because he could always lend the money to somebody else. Right now, there is no other borrower in front of him. And since there's no other borrower in front of him, this might rise to the level of a biblical lifnei iver and not just a rabbinic lifnei iver. And perhaps therefore we could make the same argument over here, that by my purchasing stolen goods from him, maybe there's even a biblical lifnei iver, just like when I borrow money from someone on interest, there may be a biblical lifnei iver. So I'm out of time and I have to go run to daven, but we will continue this discussion in the Yirtzeh Hashem tomorrow. Okay?